Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is Comprehensivist Wednesdays, and we are delighted to have CJ. And CJ is going to be talking about multiple perspectives and truth, representation of truth. So CJ, take it away.
Hi, welcome to Comprehensivist Wednesdays, an ongoing series of weekly events designed to foster the art of comprehensivity, our learning practices for building an ever more extensive, ever more intensive, and ever more integrated understanding of our worlds and its peoples. The idea of comprehensivity may best be captured by a quote from Buckminster Fuller's book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. Wanting to understand all and put everything together. Although it is impossible to fully achieve by any one human being, it is my conviction that the aspiration toward comprehensivity opens new worlds of learning that may not be possible through other approaches. Tonight, there will be 3 segments with interactive discussion after each. If any of you are new, that means you will be asked during the interactive sessions to contribute your thoughts and questions about our topic. So let's get started. Tonight's event is on shifting perspectives and representing the truth. It is based on an exquisite video presentation where Tricia Wang explains the benefits of perspective shifting to better represent the truths of our worlds and its peoples. My objective here is to situate Wang's powerful and important ideas in the context of our art of comprehensivity, our practices for understanding the world and its peoples through both extensive and intensive explorations, with the aim of forming a more and more complete and integrated comprehension of our worlds. The first segment explores Tricia Wang's thoughts about representing the truth. Tricia Wang begins her presentation exploring the technology of linear perspective, which was rediscovered and then flourished in the 15th century Renaissance Europe. Wang explains how the hype man of European perspective movement, Leon Battista Alberti, presented this new technology of optical illusion. Quote, Alberti believed that linear perspective was the highest form of art because he believed it captured reality. He said, a painting aims to represent things seen. Alberti thought that painters using linear perspective were giving society a shortcut to greater understanding, making us better people. In fact, linear perspective is an illusion. Such representations are not the objects depicted, and the optics of our eyes differ substantially from the optics of linear perspective. For instance, our binocular eyes have concave retinas affecting the inverted images our optic nerves see. Our sharp fovea centralis only sees details clearly in a tiny region near the center of our field of view. The body and its eyes constantly move, while the vanishing points in artworks are fixed. Moreover, perspective representations privilege one view to the exclusion of all the other possible optical views and any non-optical models that one might otherwise use to represent the truths of a situation. Wang tells the story of a group of Jesuit monks who, starting in the 16th century, tried to proselytize their religion by impressing the Ming Dynasty Chinese with linear perspective paintings. She emphasizes how the truth of linear perspective collided with Chinese sentiments and failed to gain traction. This Chinese view was partially captured by an earlier Tang Dynasty writer, Su Chou, who is quoted as saying, "He who judges painting according to the concept of resemblance shows the understanding of a child." Wang discusses the distortions in maps. Maps are another technology to represent the world. But as Wang emphasizes, the creators of paintings and maps, films, and data sets have many choices to make in representing their subjects. Wang shows a slide that says, by necessity, technology reduces resolution in order to render reality. The creator's choices guide what gets lost in computation. Wang also observes that mirrors can be used as a technology for the representation of truth. Mirrors probably existed long before the first polished obsidian that archaeology dates to some 8,000 years ago in Anatolia, now called Turkey. At some point in history, Wang reports, people interpreted this realness of the reflection from a glass mirror as truth. She adds, glass mirrors showed up in Shakespeare's plays as this object of truth. Wang builds to a broader thesis that truth came to be defined as a singular, stable, objective thing. She infers that we conflate what we can see with the truth, even though we know that mirrors distort left-right sense, and the optics of mirrors can be engineered to produce many surprising illusions. They merely present a distorted but insightful view of an always multifaceted truth. Virtual reality, VR, is another technology that some proponents claim give the viewer a higher fidelity access to the truth. But Wang demonstrates that despite the hype, 360-degree immersion is a curated experience created by a designer, a filmmaker, or a curator. She illustrates her point by examining the qualitatively different user experiences in two VR films, 6x9 and Confinement. Francesca Panetta, the director of the film 6x9, consulted prisoners who had lived in solitary confinement, and by listening carefully to these real survivors, she created a more realistic and compelling VR film. The quality of the curation affects the interpretation of any representation, even with virtual reality. Photography is another technology whose seeming realism has blinded people to its illusions, distortions, and biases. She quotes the filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard, "Photography is truth." Then, to illustrate how insidious the biases in photography can be, Wang reports on the widely read and esteemed National Geographic magazine with its famous photography. But their photos are frequently staged, and in 2018, the current editor, Susan Goldberg, admitted that past content was racist, in some cases disturbingly racist. Photography is not innocent and truthful, but reflects the biases of photographers, curators, and editors. Although Wang only briefly mentions it, big data is another mesmerizing technology which carries powerful but illusory intonations that it reveals the truth. Another example of technology with often illusory effects is mentioned in the 1981 book Critical Path, where Buckminster Fuller wrote, "Words are tools." So by Wang's logic, language, the technology of words, also suffers from the inherent limitations of any technological representation. While each technology is valuable in that it can reveal new aspects of the truth, Wang emphasizes throughout that technological representations are frequently and erroneously abstracted to be the truth. She cautions us, we still have the myth that we can see reality from a single perspective, and that single perspective is the objective truth, when in fact, we actually have what Wang calls the limits of a single perspective. So Shrikant, I'd like to do a breakout. I'm thinking the number of participants plus maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. I don't know how much time we have.
Sure. So let's do that. It's going to be average of 7 participants in the breakout room. So let's do about maybe 13 minutes or so. And so what do you want people to do in the breakout rooms?
I'd like each participant to spend 1 minute or so, try to be brief, sharing your thoughts and questions on representations of the truth and perspectives and their limits, and then spend the last 5 minutes or so, whatever's remaining, to explore each other's thoughts and questions a little deeper.
Wonderful. And when we come back, we are going to the second section of the presentation.
Yes.
Got it. Excellent. So I'm starting the breakout rooms now.
Yeah, I think this first segment was very important. So if anyone is really confused or has a blocking question that's going to, not make it harder to hear the next segment, we should probably take 1 or 2 questions, urgent questions. There's going to be a time later for everyone to ask your ordinary questions. But if someone's really puzzled about something or confused, I think we should address it now. So,
okay, folks, if you have a burning question, urgent question that is stopping you, blocking you from understanding this topic at all, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Otherwise, we are off to the next section. I'm going to give about 15 more seconds. Otherwise, we'll start with the second section. Phil, what's your burning question? Just keep it very brief and just go ahead.
Well, something came up about AI that was interesting because but the question is whether, because we don't understand how it could learn in a way that's beyond our understanding. So I wonder whether we really are after truth or whether we are anxious about finding the truth as not ours.
Okay.
Yeah, that I think that's the issue of representation. The AI has represented a truth for us, and it may collide with our views and our values, but maybe the AI is right and it's our views and values that are mistaken. Or maybe the AI has a programming glitch or was fed biased data and it's about to lead us astray. It's the fundamental question of all the human experience. What are we to do person A comes to us and says, do X, and person B says, no, let's do Y. And we have to assess and evaluate that, because there, a priori, we don't know whether the computer's programmed with a glitch or we are. But we have to move on. So I hope that helps.
All right, let's go to the next section.
Okay. The second segment is going to focus on Tricia Wang's idea of perspective shifting. In the stories Tricia Wang develops in her presentation, she emphasizes how the truth of one representation by a technology can collide with the values of other people. The Ming-era Chinese didn't value the seemingly realistic illusions in the art of linear perspective. The map maker, the photographer, the journalist, the writer, the editor, the VR film producer cannot give the armchair traveler the high fidelity experience of actually engaging with a far off place and its peoples. The vicarious experience is not the real experience. The gamer and the couch potato watching representations on a screen are not experiencing our real world. Technology-enhanced representations can and do inform our understanding of the world, but they are always incomplete. Their view of reality is always distorted. This inherent narrowness of representations can collide with the values and understandings of other people, which in turn can cause friction and conflict. Wang defines perspective collision as when the outputs of technology or the things we make up end up revealing the limited perspective of their creators. Makes us wonder, how can we avoid such perspective collisions? Wang recommends developing the skill of perspective shifting, which she defines as the ability to see the world from another person's point of view. Essentially, it's empathy. She further explains, understanding the world is not about replicating one perspective. It's about representing multiple perspectives. This is the work of perspective shifting. Everyone needs to learn how to perspective shift. This involves skills like listening to understand, instead of just asking questions about what we already know, to see the greater context beyond the technology, instead of just focusing on its interaction with the user, to identify things that are very difficult to measure, not just making decisions off of data sets that we already have. It's also about asking, who else do we need to invite to the table instead of just working with the default majority. So we're ready for the second breakout. This time, I'd like each participant to share their thoughts or questions about perspective shifting for 1 minute again. And then maybe a little shorter this time, maybe 3 minutes for discussion.
Sure. Okay, so folks, I'm starting the breakout rooms now. And we will be back here in about 12 minutes, 11 to 12 minutes. Starting the breakout rooms now. Okay. Floor is yours.
Yes, so we started accumulating some questions. I hope the other groups also have accumulated some questions. We're going to have an opportunity for everyone to ask questions after this next segment.
So I want to let people know, come up with the best question you have, okay? And we'll organize all the questions and we will go after all of them. So don't be shy, try to keep questions, ideally just write them down so that you can, you can get hold of them. And then if you come up with better questions, replace them with the better questions. Go ahead, CJ.
Right. So the people in my group, I hope to hear your questions again. But first, segment 3. In this third and final segment, I'll explore the truth and our comprehensivity. In the exchange after her presentation in the video I highlighted in the event description, Tricia Wang explains that seeking the truth is a terrible goal. I believe what she means is that seeking the truth predisposes us to converge on a single representation of our subject or a situation, which then blocks us from apprehending its full multi-perspectival context. Wang suggests that perspective shifting should replace our search for truth as the objective for understanding. I agree with her, but I would go further. I would place perspective shifts in the broader context of understanding as a thoroughly refined ignorance. This thoroughly refined ignorance is one of the guiding values we have been developing for our comprehensive learning during several past events. In comprehensive learning, we aspire to integrate many perspectives, to use Wang's language. One way to think about our refined ignorance would be to identify each aspect of each perspective with a series of yes-no questions and their answers that locates it, as in the game 20 questions. Then we can imagine other games of 20 questions that distinguish each perspective from the others. Finally, more such games could distinguish the different ways to integrate all of the identified perspectives into a synergetic whole. In this way, our ignorance can be seen as the fabric of questions that structures our comprehensive learning. Our thoroughly refined ignorance is based on ignorance because questions guide all inquiry, and all principles can be seen as the answers to contextualized questions. It is refined because nuanced questions can distinguish different perspectives, different hypotheses, and different interpretations. It is thorough because our steadfast comprehensivity aspires to a comprehensive understanding of the world and its peoples. Tricia Wang's idea of shifting perspective is an important tool in helping us to more thoroughly refine our ignorance. In the event I organized last December on the value of multiple working hypotheses, the video is on YouTube in case you missed it. In that event, we examined the epistemic virtue of T.C. Chamberlain's great contribution to the moral reform of science with discriminating edges of multiple working hypotheses. How does Wang's method of perspective shifting compare with Chamberlain's multiple working hypotheses? I think the differences are a matter of language. A hypothesis in science assumes all the experiences and refined ignorance that went into formulating it and supporting its plausibility. All this context is in fact a perspective, the perspective that sees the hypothesis as reasonable. So a perspective shift can be seen as essentially the same as considering another possible working hypothesis together with its context. Multiple working hypotheses and perspective shifts provide the same benefit to the explorer in universe, to form a more thoroughly refined ignorance. Both Wang's perspective shifts and Chamberlain's multiple working hypotheses remind us that comprehensive thinking is broader than any one perspective or any one hypothesis. Wang's perspective shifts are more suggestive of the language of the humanities and social sciences in highlighting context, whereas Chamberlain's multiple working hypotheses invokes the language of scientific discourse. Now, perhaps, we are in a position to see the wisdom in Tricia Wang's astonishing soundbite, "Don't trust the truth." Truth can be seen as the coherence of a perspective or hypothesis with the experiences and beliefs that justify it. So every truth has a perspective. Such a perspective has limitations. It is informed by limited experience, limited assumptions, and the limits of the methodology organizing its beliefs. Perspective shifting is the process of considering other contexts and other points of view. Since life is finite, we cannot consider all possible points of view, all possible assumptions, all possible hypotheses, everyone's full set of experiences, and all possible contexts. So our truths are always limited and always incomplete. In the end, we see that perspective shifting, multiple working hypotheses, and engaging multiple approaches or traditions of inquiry and action can help us form a more thoroughly refined ignorance. This ignorance, then, is the broadest comprehensive comprehension, and it is the best representation of truth that we can acquire at any time. Our thoroughly refined ignorance as a truth may be one of our best tools for assessing our desires to effectively organize a design for better shaping our futures. But at every moment, it is incomplete, and therefore it is never truly trustworthy. So Tricia Wang is profoundly correct when she warns us, don't trust the truth. Shrikant, I'd like to invite everyone to ask questions for a group Q&A that we will then all try to answer. I shared with you in an email 3 questions that I'd like to start with.
Okay.
But maybe we should gather everyone's questions, or should we start with these 3 questions and then gather up?
Let's get, I think it's a good idea to get everybody's mind going with their questions and questions of other people. And then we will go ahead and, put them along with your questions. Does that make sense? So we'll organize the questions, and then I will see, let's look at the shape of the questions that come up, organize those questions, and then provide, start. I think your first question is a good question to start, and then we will bring other people's questions in the middle and go through, and organize your questions amongst the other questions. So that way we'll hit everything. Make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Wonderful. Folks, go ahead. Now it's your turn. Go ahead. Only questions at this point. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom to put your questions on the table. All your questions will be answered by everybody. So this is a great opportunity to get all these wonderful people answering whatever questions that you think are the most important. So go ahead and type. Kyrie, go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant. And thank you, CJ. So my question, I guess, just taking a whole bird's eye view of all parts of the presentation tonight, how are we then, as a society or multiple societies, the human race, broken down to our individual societies and groups, to move forward in a way when where it seems we're always striving for the truth. You could say the ultimate truth, but just, at this point, really everyday truth, especially these days. And, in this entire pandemic situation that we're in, where many questions have been asked of the truth, and then there's disinformation and the gatekeepers of the truth. I brought up in relating to what another man said, Phil, I believe, about AI.
Let's keep it to questions. Let's keep the questions brief, Kyrie, so we can get all the questions in, and then we will go ahead and let everybody answer it. Okay, so how do we strive for truth when there is so much disinformation, kind of cross purposes going on? Excellent. Phil, what's your question?
Well, since every sort of set of trying to find some sort of representation is a series of games, what I admire is that perspective shifting allows us to turn it into a dynamic system. However, it still does not escape the boundaries of the game, the system structure of the game. In order to make it more dynamic, you have to have structures within it that's unpredictable, that is unknown, so the game cannot be predicted, like this is how you get used to doing this thing. How do you transfer something that is so dynamic, that is unfolding the structure itself while you're playing the game or trying to find the object or find the resolution?
Wow. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. These are fantastic questions, guys. Next up is Mike. Mike, can you top that?
Oh, I can't top any of these, but let me introduce the concept that truth is not a binary yes or no. Truth is a state vector with many solutions. How do you structure your life or a court case when you're right and your opponent knows he's right, and you need to navigate that, and many of the solutions might be even imaginary or in some alternate universe? How do you structure your life to accomplish the fact that truth is not binary?
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, fantastic questions. Any more questions? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to put more questions on the table. Cheryl, followed by Jeff. Cheryl.
Well, based on the questions that were just asked, I've been thinking about that too, because that whole notion that multiple perspectives, comprehensive ignorance, that all resonates with me. But at the same time, and the pragmatic, and how do you allow for multiple perspectives in very different contexts in people's lives, like a court case, et cetera? So it's just sort of building on the former question, I think.
Wonderful, wonderful. Excellent, thank you. Next up is Jeff, Kevin, and Bent. Jeff.
My question is, what can we do to help strengthen a person's willingness and ability to change their mind?
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Next up is Kevin, followed by Bent. Kevin.
My question would be, what's the truth meaning? Here's a perspective, because normally we understand truth is represent the being according to fact or reality. If truth is perspective, how can it be apply to practice? Let's see, should we redefine the meaning of a word for truth? Okay, that's a perspective, not truth. Because by the way, I'm going to share one is John Peterson said, truth is don't tell the truth, at least don't lie. So that's a common practice like that. So we understand this way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Bent. Bent, go ahead.
Yes, my question is, granting the value of perspective shifting, whether there aren't circumstances, for example, when humanity is facing collective problems, whether that's the COVID-19 crisis or global warming, where particular perspectives aren't helpful in sharing a collective problem, and whether I gave the example in the breakout room of having a shared means of keeping time so that we can all understand what time it is. But I'd give other examples of having a shared language so we can communicate, and also having a shared story so we can have a shared sense of meaning. And so I wonder about those questions of collective meaning and problem solving, and how that relates to the topic at hand.
Wonderful. All right, folks, these are fascinating questions. I'm going to start with the first. Let's start with CJ's. Go ahead.
Shrikant, I think El Hisak's comment could be turned into a question.
Okay, that was before the, I don't know what the question is. Give me a second.
Perspective shifting versus paradigm. Is perspective shifting paradigm shifting, or what's the difference?
Sure. Excellent.
Yes, sure, thanks. Yes, it was just a question about the difference between a perspective shift and a paradigm shift. And I have an interest in scientific paradigm shift, and how does perspective shift interlock with that or interlace. And thanks.
And then Zoo asked a question in our breakout about the biases of perspective shifts. Mm-hmm. If she would like to ask her question, or maybe we can just go with that.
Bias. Can you repeat that again? Sorry, CJ.
My notes are, what are the biases in the perspective shifts, and how to deal with biases that might be involved in the shifting.
Okay.
She would probably put it differently,
sure,
but if she doesn't want to jump in, we'll just have to do our best.
Sure.
No, that was fine. I think you did a good job, CJ. But yes, because our biases are so difficult for us to uncover. They're often easier for others to uncover. How do we, to get a real perspective shift, we need to challenge the bias we may have. So that was my question. How does one challenge one's biases?
Wonderful. All right. So CJ, I have some ideas about organizing these questions. I would like to start with your first question. And as people are dealing with that question, I'm proposing to organize all these, or just order them. The thing is that I really like the way in which everybody asked the questions. So I'm simply going to choose an order and then have people repeat the question in their own words. So that way we get to the heart of everything that they are asking. And folks, when I call upon you to ask the question, try to be as brief as possible and to just name the question within less than 3 sentences. So that way, people can focus their mind on it. and you will get really good answers. So does that sound okay to you, CJ?
Yeah, that sounds good. So we'll start with my first question.
Go ahead.
Can any single technology ever represent more than a narrow, distorted glimpse of the truth? Are all representations necessarily low fidelity? If you have an answer for that question,
go ahead and type. Yeah, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Bent, did you want to say something about the question?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a shot at it. Thank you.
Go ahead. Just next time, just a heads up. Next time, just go ahead and raise your hand or type exclamation mark. Go ahead, Bent.
Thank you. I just want to answer that. I just want to point out that humans exist on so many levels and in so many dimensions. For example, our historical memory. So we exist across the field of time in our consciousness, because we can imagine the past and future, our own past experiences. So just on that note, I think it would be impossible for anything to represent the fullness of human consciousness, because it is kind of this overflowing font of awareness that is endless. That's all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Bent. Next up is Madeline, followed by Sandy. Madeline.
Yes, I have a question about the question, which is, the technology you're talking about, CJ, is that mostly electronic, or do you include the wheel and the fork and things like that?
And the word, language.
Okay. Because I was thinking with electronic technology, it's as if you're only seeing everything from different types of linear perspective, whether it's foreshortening or 3-point perspective or 1-point perspective, that it's kind of the equivalent of not ever having a paradigm shift if you're only looking through different perspectives through one technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Sandy, Allison, and Phil. Sandy.
I would go beyond what Trisha Wang said about truth. When she said, don't trust the truth, I'd say get rid of the truth altogether. Consider the truth as nothing really more than a belief about the way things are. And it's better to come up with meaningful or useful explanations for what's happening so that we can do something with that knowledge.
Thank you, Sandy. Next up is Allison.
I think technology is always limited because it's two-dimensional. I mean, even if you see a 3D film, it's not really 3D. And I mean, one thing that I have really found, I'm a teacher and I taught online for 7 months before meeting my kids in person. And the thing that we kept saying was like, everybody looked like a 3D movie coming to life. And it was very, very strange. And I noticed the same thing when we had, like with the Philadelphia group, I met most people online and then finally met them in the summer and a couple of social events. And everybody looked the same, talked the same but yet it was different, you know? And I find like on Zoom, it's hard to read body language. And eye contact is completely missing entirely. You never know quite who somebody's looking at, or you might see a certain kind of body language and you're thinking, oh, they're upset at something I said. And really they're upset because somebody's lawnmower went off and it was really loud. And so you don't, things get misconstrued a lot. So I think that's something that's really, really missing. And you miss sometimes there's like an electricity between people when you're in person, or there's, the way people smell, or the way, there's just so much that's missing when you're on, using technology.
Great observations. Thank you, Allison. Next up is Phil, Maritza, and Judith. Phil.
Well, since multiple perspectives shifting is so dependent perspective itself is so dependent on the particular situation and one's presence at the situation. We do not have the technology to do it now, but it seems to be the technology that would be required as Star Trek's teleporting, in which you are able to be teleported literally and at the presence of multiple places so you could actually experience it. But even then, you will not experience the interiority of the other, which is still limiting, but at least you would be able to be at the presence of the thing. So I don't know whether teleporting could ever be achieved, because otherwise you are doing a representation, rather being at the presence of the thing itself.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Maritza, Judith, Al, and Cheryl. Maritza.
I think the interesting thing about technology is that it allows us to further disillusion ourselves that information equals understanding. I think that we become ever increasingly at risk for an absolute missing of true understanding, because we keep collecting all this information and we don't really necessarily collect it, because now it all sits collected for us because of the wonders of technology. But without the proper emphasis or striving towards understanding, then we just have all this knowledge without any understanding of it. And if a shift in our perspectives, if that's going to be our tool for greater comprehensivity, I like to equate comprehensivity with understanding. And I just think that we find ourselves in technology is a current going in the wrong direction for us towards our goal of comprehensivity.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marisa. Next up is Judith, Al, Cheryl, Kevin, and Evanique. Judith.
I don't think it's possible how did you phrase it, that technology can ever come close to representing the truth? Because as you said, there is no the truth. There are just a lot of perspectives of truths. And I think that the purpose of any technology, whether it's a paintbrush or a computer AI or language, is to show one perspective that is meaningful for us and helps us to accomplish things, just helps us to live better. But it doesn't show us ever the whole truth. But we can't live without anything like that at all, or we just be like plants, passive. So by our nature, we use technologies, all these different technologies. And the important thing is that we have to remember that there are limitations, and there are limitations that we won't be able to see, and find ways just to be more open to that fact, so that when a different perspective is presented for us, we can recognize this is another way of seeing it is equally valid.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. Next up is Elle, followed by Cheryl. Elle.
Hi, this is Elle, or Ellen if you prefer. Well, one simple comment I have is that if one doesn't like the truth, one can contribute to changing the truth in a small way, and then that may contribute to not just a perspective change, but an actual change. And I was looking at the comparing the perspective change to paradigm shift, or perspective shift to paradigm shift. And there is a good book written by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of I think it's Paradigm.
Revolution.
Yeah, that's it, 1962 or so. And I think it's interesting to compare the two, but that would take a discussion. So that was my topic, and I was introducing that with CJ in our breakout room when we got cut off.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Al. Thank you.
Okay.
Next up is Cheryl, Kevin, and Evanique. Cheryl.
Well, I'm actually going to respond to something somebody said earlier because it seemed to me it's such a good example of how we're experiencing something similar in time, but have two completely different perspectives. Because I agree that being in person, there is something about that that is a reality that is important. But I actually, honestly, the whole Zoom thing and this pandemic has been amazing for me. I have met so many people, and this right here is an example, and formed groups that I never could have done before. And I understand that's about my context because I'm not having to teach I'm not having to do a lot of things. But for me, this has been joyous. And I also think about all the ways that, because there's this trend to say, here's this horrible thing that technology is doing. But in some way, it doesn't matter. It's here. We just have to figure out what, instead of saying, oh, it's awful and it's whatever. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Wonderful. Great observation. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. Next up is Kevin, followed by Evanique.
Yeah, thank you, Sanka. For me, it's not just technology that present the truth. The big challenge are human self. We use the 5 senses to learn the truth, learn the outside world. Our powerful enough try absorb those not technology stuff. We need to change our own component to adapt to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Evanique, Charlie, Shrikant, and CJ. Evanique.
Yeah, I think the one thing you gotta look at technology is that it's a tool. So I think to say that technology can't do anything that the human doesn't tell it to do, I think that's the limit of it. So yeah, it is. I agree that it is just a very limited way of getting to the truth because it's up to the person's bias. Even like looking at Google, like I think Maritza mentioned, like Google, you can go and find the information. Well, I think it was another Netflix documentary that talked about how Google slants it to depending on a person's views. So if you look up coronavirus and you're on the right wing, they will show you certain things. If you're left, they'll show you certain things. So even that has been biased by algorithms. So it's just a slither of truth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is Charlie.
I have a little bit of a problem with the whole concept.
Charlie, can you speak into the mic?
Okay. Am I better now?
Better.
Okay. Still not good. Anyway, I'm having a little trouble with the whole concept because for me, when I think of perspective, okay, that's kind of like a view a person has. But the thing is that you have like the conscious view, you have the subconscious view, you have repression, projection, and it's constantly shifting over time. And so even people who've been married for 50 years don't really know each other. And for that matter, a person gets to be elder, they still don't even know themselves. They don't even know what their perspective is if you try to take the entire picture. Now, if there's some kind of technology that can somehow or other tap into the brain and know what every single neuron is doing, then you'd have the question as well, does what is happening in the brain really correspond to that person's self, or what it is that makes them them? So it's like it seems like it's and something with good intentions, but it just doesn't seem very practical. Kind of like utilitarianism. It seems like greatest good for the greatest many, but when you start looking at the details of how you Are you going to do it? It's like, no, it's just a rat's nest.
Thank you, Charlie. So it's going to be me, Mike, and then CJ, and then we'll go to the next question. I want to give an example of what that I gave when Sanjay was describing perception. So I gave the example of an apple. So imagine yourself eating an apple. Okay, you see the apple, the red apple. You can smell it. You can hold. You can see that it is firm. You can see, you can taste it, you can eat it. So there is like proprioception of actually feeling it inside your mouth. That's a full experience of an apple, a person taking an apple from all the senses. Now, when you're reading about an apple, when you're using the book technology, the print technology to experience an apple, there's only so much that can be done through it. And you're going to get a perspective on that apple. Are very good at writing. They will give you, but it will be a perspective. When you see an apple on a television, only certain kinds of things, and where it is, how it is pointed to, how the camera captures it, how the lighting is over there is going to shape what it is. So any technology kind of enhances certain senses and reduces certain senses. So it is by its nature selective. And that's not always negative. When you look at Leonardo, he talks about how to see. And one of his prescriptions is that you draw in order to learn how to see. When you actually start capturing things with your hand or what you're seeing with your eye, you learn to see better. So it's not always that a sense is degraded by technology. It can also be enhanced. But all of these technology, any technology that you use will give you a different perspective on it. And so it's a good idea to use multiple technologies while recognizing the limits of each of them and how our brain processes those. So that's the comment that I had. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by CJ, and then we'll go to the next question. Mike.
I learned a new word on Monday from Herr Friedrich Nietzsche, and that word was aphorism. And my aphorism for this evening is justice is blind. And though I said that truth is a multi-dimensional nonlinear state vector, I think that it needs to be passed through a filter such as justice is blind to make it applicable to the situation we're dealing with. So Zoom is such a good filter. Is an example of that kind of a filter, and there's similar filters that are applicable in given situations as to how you eliminate the noise from the decision process.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is CJ.
I'm going to limit myself to a brief statement of support for Charlie. Charlie, you really are getting it. Your comments are exactly the issues we're trying to grapple with here. And I'll make a general comment on everyone's comments. You all answered the question as well or better than me, each with a different perspective. It's a microcosm of our whole topic is everyone's aggregated answers. So excellent work. Let's see if we have time for another.
Yes, what I'm going to do is that let's take your second question, because your questions so far, your record has been fantastic. You've put a question on the table that has gotten all these people to produce all these great answers. So can you go with your second question, please?
Yes, my second question is perspective shifting a vital skill for working with technology, representations, and truth.
All right, folks, if you have answers to this question, and I'm sure you do, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. First up is Evanique.
Short answer, yes. I think it is an essential tool to evaluating truth and perspectives and technology. I think, I think we all get caught up in our own biases and think that we have the truth. And it's just not true. I mean, ironically, I know I'm contradicting myself, but it's not true. We have what we see, we have our perspective, we have our perspective based on our lens of our values that we've grown up with or have been taught. But what we don't have is a truth. We have our truth, our personal truth, but we don't have the truth.
Next up, thanks, Evanik. Next up is Sandy.
In the word no, it's not vital, it's not essential. What comprehensivism requires in my book is not only breadth of perspectives, but it requires depth as well. And this discussion is good because it's focusing on one aspect of that, which is the breadth of scope, but that's not enough. We need to dig in as well. So that it's not enough.
Thank you, Sandy. Next up is Phil, followed by KF. Phil.
I think that there's only a partial answer. And the partial answer is, in a way, we're fighting the wrong war. Because we're fighting the wrong war about the curating of the narrative. And so that part is good, but the form is wrong, because the form now, I'm putting the form is that there's also not only the narrative, but the carrier wave, the wave itself. And this came to me when I first listened to a sitar long time ago. There's something about the twang in the sitar that hit you directly into your nervous systems. Now, it was played beautifully and is nice, and it wasn't trying to be subversive. But I think now the carrier wave in the kind of electronic media we have is not necessarily just attacking the content and the curation, but is also, in a sense, attacking the mind itself that could create an alternative narration to that. And so therefore it subverts the basic foundation of the mind being able to be critical, because it actually tunes the mind in a way and transforms the mind so it can no longer distinguish the substructure from the surface structure. And I think that's the danger. And we're finding the last war, the current wars, how do you get away from the carrier wave that, in a sense, invade the nervous system itself like a bunch of ants crawling through your nervous system? That is where the real problem lies, not in shifting the perspective.
Marshall McLuhan says medium is the message. So that's, the carrier wave. Next up is KF, followed by Kevin. KF.
Alrighty, can everyone hear me?
It's very faint. If you could speak more into the mic, please.
Okay, how about now?
Better, go ahead.
Okay. I believe that the technique you mentioned, perspective shifting, is helpful, but I don't believe it's absolutely necessary. The reason being is that I don't believe there's such a thing as absolute truth. And in a way, it's the thought process of kind of trying to understand a different perspective, trying to generate a slightly different view. Maybe just the process itself is more important, because it eventually generates more eventualities or other outcomes that causes other people to change their perspective. Perhaps that process, in my mind, is more important than just one person to shift the perspective shift into all these other perspectives. Because to me, to do that as a one individual would require too much energy. Well, in a way, it's almost inhuman. How is it possible for one individual to be able to understand all these perspectives? even if given a lot of time and resource. At least that's my perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, KF. Next up is going to be Kevin, Madeline, and Charlie. Kevin.
Thank you. My short answer would be when we cannot find the truth, try to shift the perspective. Sometimes the truth is perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Madeline, followed by Charlie.
Yes, I'm a bit disturbed about all the relativism. I liked what Phil said about the carrier wave. I would call that, I might even call that a belief. Like when I think about the modern flat Earth society, they start with a core belief, which is that the Earth is flat. And if you go to their website, you can see that based around that, there's some logic, there's some thinking, there's some imagery. They're reasoning things out from a core belief that I believe is wrong. And so a belief can be like a gravity well, that no matter how many perspectives you collect around it, they're going to distort around the gravity well, unless you change the paradigm, which is what Al had mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Charlie.
Yeah, I'm going to be kind of repeating what other people have said, but with just a slightly different twist. A back and forth is in psychology is called mirroring. Okay, when an infant first starts to develop an attachment with her mother, one of the most important things is this process of where the mother mirrors back what she believes the infant is feeling, so that the infant realizes, yeah, these are my feelings. So there's a validation sort of thing that's going on, and that process continues as you get older in friendships, and so that if you have a good friendship, you have empathy for the other person that has been validated. You have this back and forth. This is what I hear you saying, and the person says, yeah, that's what I was saying. And but the thing is you only have a limited number of people with whom you can do that, and so your what you might call your ground truth, okay, of actual experience is very limited, and so that trying to extrapolate from that small amount of data is problematic, to put it mildly. Okay, so if you're in the manufacturing, the technology industry, where you're intending to have millions, if not billions, of customers, nobody knows millions of people. Okay, and so how what would it mean for somebody to have empathic skills that would inform the process of creating a technology? I mean, people do it. People say, oh, well, French people are this way and American people are that way, and so on. But it's reality seems to be a lot more complicated than many people just tend to assume.
Wonderful. So it's going to be me followed by CJ, and then we'll go to the next question. My favorite way of, I'm a big fan of changing perspectives, perspective shifting. And my favorite way of doing that is in these meetups. This is why I run the meetups, because what happens is that, look at the previous question, or look at our meetups on Tao Te Ching. We put something very simple on the table, a question or a short poem, and then hear all these perspectives. There is no way, no matter how much I try to study this one chapter or one poem of Tao Te Ching for hours using multiple translations, the entire range of perspectives that I can conceive of and come up with is quite limited as compared to what people bring. It's the fact that it's another human being with an entirely different context allows them to bring a radically different perspective. So the cheapest way and the most effective way is to engage in a deep conversation in a context where multiple people who are trying to get at the truth bring their perspectives openly in front of other people, especially when they are conflicting perspectives. And that's what I like about these meetups. Next up is CJ. CJ, you're on mute.
Thanks everyone for all those thoughts. That was wonderful. And Shrikant, you're right. That's the value of this. One of the points that was sort of in L's question, which isn't exactly this question, and Zoo's and Sandy's comment is perspective. Well, I think everyone agrees, even the people who disagreed, I think, agree that perspective shifting is vital. There's a back of the question: is perspective shifting, the only tool? Do we need other tools? In the presentation, I talked about multiple working hypotheses as another tool, but said it's essentially a synonym to perspective shifting. And so it's an interesting theoretical question that I'm not going to answer, but my answer will be a question. Is perspective shifting what any skill for representing truth and perspective, is that a general abstract term that captures every possible attempt at wrestling with representation, truth, situation, context? Or could we perhaps define a set of skills where perspective shifting is just one distinct one, and then there are some others we need to learn? That's the open question that I'm taking away from that section of commentary.
Wonderful. So now I'm going to go for 4 questions by 4 different people: Phil, Kyrie, Jeff, and Zoo, all of which talk about, kind of point to the natures, different kinds of nature, the nature involved in this process. So Phil, can you go ahead and repeat your question about the dynamic nature of this process and how it interacts with the structures? Phil, you're on mute though.
I said, I don't know if I can repeat it. I'll try to say something. I think this is a very, very important process because it turns it into a dynamic system. What I call not theme and variation, but a continue turning into the next thing. My question is that since we operate within a kind of a framework of some sort, in a sense, to get out of the game of playing this game, we have to radically shift this so the game itself, the structure of the game itself, is shifting completely. The rug pull out of us so that we could, in sense, begin to see a new way of seeing along the way of shifting, because otherwise we're just shifting like the object, like steeplechase. You run the hurdle, you do the water jump, you do this and that. We're all familiar with that procedure. Now do something where the guy is like, we don't know what's going to happen. You're just going to do this thing, and then suddenly a thing will happen, and then you're going to have to respond to it. I think that is an important part, because the indeterminacy in the structure itself is an important part of exploring beyond the already known to explode into a different dynamic dimension.
All right, wonderful. So folks, if you would like to answer that, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Or if you have any comments about that, how do you come up with a strategy of dealing with the unknown unknowns? How do you come up with a strategy which is a way of expanding the strategies that you're using, shaking you up every time? It's going to be Zoo, CJ, and Madeline next. Zoo.
Yes, I think this idea of the structure having perhaps even some randomness, or being able to, CJ brought up that, we could see things from different uh, perspectives, but then there are things that we don't see because we can't imagine that perspective. So I think things like, in physics, the collider, what did they do? They created these conditions, and they couldn't really hypothesize. They could hypothesize what would happen, but a lot of it was sometimes just particles appeared, and they appeared for a brief flash of time, and they were able to see that there are things out there that we can now name, and we can adjust our theory of how things work because of some seemingly random event. So sometimes openness in certain kinds of studies, or another thing I think is important is the filter we look at it. That there is the perspective that's particular, but there's also the filter. Like, we can look at things through a Marxist filter, or a filter of the Tao. Like, how do these things, or the filter of different types of writers who represent different communities. And that allows us, because we are limited, and often we don't see our own limitations.
Thank you, Sue. Next up is CJ, Madeline, and Sandy. CJ.
Yeah, what I like about Phil's question is exploring these dynamics of perspective shifting. The framework, Phil asked for a framework. The framework I would situate this in would be the approach or the framework of a tradition of inquiry and action. Traditions of inquiry and action are one of the models I've been using in thinking about comprehensive learning. And the different traditions of inquiry and action are different individuals. Each individual may have their methodology. Descartes is famous for, I'm going to come up with a methodology that through this inquiry will give me, truth. And many people have believed that they can invent a technology that will sort of systematically produce truths, sort of like, turning the crank. But I'm watching. I've just halfway through the event on Aborigines that Maritza organized, and these methodologies are dismissive of other approaches. And one of the values I've been trying to instill in our discussion of comprehensive learning is that to not be arrogant, to not be imperial, to not be colonial, we need to include indigenous thinking, and pay attention to other traditions of inquiry and action, even if Descartes or anyone else hasn't sanctioned them as the one true right method for producing truths. So my answer to Phil is the dynamics of perspective shifting fit in a tradition of inquiry and action, and each of us and each culture represents one possible dynamic for perspective shifting. And comprehensive learning is this process of, it is exactly Phil's question. It's exploring the dynamics through the different traditions. Each one might teach us some new element, some new imaginative capability. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, CJ. Next up is Madeline, Sandy, Phil, and Judith. Madeline.
I would say to get out of it, the way to do it would be to use a different sense mentally. So perspective is very related to optics. And so perspective and hypothesis are very related to optics. So what if you use something like smell instead, or sound, as a way of framing the world and looking at analogies? Also, CJ, you just mentioned Maritza's presentation on the Aborigines. I thought one part that was extremely interesting was they went fishing one day in a group. They needed fish for everyone, but they only caught one fish. And then they did something with the trees. And when they went fishing again, the place was full of fish and they caught a lot of fish. Because I have a Western perspective, I said, and they did something with the trees. But if I had been from their culture, I would have said, because they did something with the trees, they caught a lot of fish.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Sandy, Phil, and Judith. Sandy.
So to better understand the nature of what it is we're trying to learn about, we could circle around and look from visual angles to this object, and we could climb up on top of it and look down underneath it, and you know, we could imagine going inside it and what we might see from the inside. But you know, we could also do an experiment if we're scientifically inclined, and we might get a stick or a hammer and hit it and find out that it's a wonderful resonant, and we would learn that it's better than anything else. It's probably a bell, but we would never know that just by looking at it, no matter how many angles we look at it. So this is what Madeline was saying. I'm just really elaborating on that we need to use our senses, all of our instruments, get out the microscope, take a chip of it and put it into some solution and take it to the chemistry lab. We can do all kinds of things, but it's more than just the perspective. It really requires a paradigm shift in the sense that we're using a different kind of technology, a different kind of approach, not just another approach.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandy. Next up is Phil.
Yeah, I like some of the answers about including other perspectives from other cultures that are very different. But I would go one step beyond that. I would say that you must include the outcast, this one who has been discredited, the one that you disrespect and say, oh, this guy is bordering on being crazy. Like, let him in. And not only let him in, but require that he gets his say. And you bear what they say, even though like, oh my God, there he goes again, right? So because it might break through at some point. So don't let him in just to sit him in the corner and say, you be quiet, we're letting you in because the official rules. You got to say, he gets the 15 minutes like everybody else. That's how I would do it. The guy who's almost a criminal.
Thank you, Phil. Next up is Judith, and then Shrikant and CJ. I don't know if CJ wants to go, but Judith.
Okay, I'm not always very good at expressing myself, so I just am hoping that this doesn't come across in a bad way. But when we're talking about perspective shifting, and I think that is a good thing, don't get me wrong, but I was just thinking that what are we doing by saying that we need to perspective shift? I mean, like, are we missing something about that? Because we look at the Aborigines, this is when I was thinking about it, or like when we went to China with our perspective drawing, right? And we were like, hey, look at this. See, you could do things differently. But we should have been maybe looking, you know, hey, what can we see that they're doing that's good and interesting? But then on the other hand, if that's what is the ideal, if that's the ideal,
then we could turn around and say, Aborigines, look what we're doing. Take from us the great things, you know? So at what point then is perspective shifting? Maybe there's something that's missing that where you don't want to. Maybe you want to own, at times you may want to selectively choose to own and be your authentic self, because you can't be everything. So yes, there are times when you want to explore the world and learn more and make yourself more capable and better and more inclusive and a whole bunch of good things. But maybe there are times when you want to own your own, you know, what you are and not be another perspective, selectively choose not to add a perspective to your view or your presentation, your art, or whatever it is you're doing. Just a thought.
Thank you, Judith. You know what? Let's go to the next question. That was by Kyrie. Kyrie, can you go ahead? Go ahead.
Shrikant, maybe I'll quickly comment on Phil and Judith.
Go ahead.
Phil, I love the idea of including crazies and criminals. One of my core beliefs is that all humans have values. I think the prison system is a waste of human potential. Now, I don't propose that, you know, they live in my neighborhood, but I think we need to do something better than put them in prisons. I haven't figured that one out yet, but they should be part of the conversation. Let's bring them in via Zoom at least. And Judith, what I heard you say is that maybe we need to refrain from certain perspective shifts. And this is an issue I've been thinking about. Could there be a tradition of inquiry and action that once you consider it, you know, so poisons your mind that, you know, you're headed to suicide? Perhaps, you know, engaging the KKK or the Taliban, or, well, you know, actually those are, you know, would that be mind opening or mind destroying? Are there traditions of inquiry and action we should not pursue? I mean, you know, it's the challenge for my whole approach of comprehensive learning is if there's a tradition of inquiry and action that if you consider it, it blows up the universe, the mind of God, poof, disappears. Should we worry about that? I'm not going to answer that one either, but I heard in your commentary that maybe not all perspective shifts should be engaged with equal, and you're right, you know, we need to think about that.
Thank you, CJ. Next up, Kyrie, could you go ahead and restate your question? Is he there? You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm here. Yes, let me try to restate that. So basically, I was trying to say is how do we, you know, move forward within our individual societies toward this truth finding, you know, and using the and shifting perspectives and really just getting in the forefront of our minds that we don't know everything, and having that refined ignorance in light of the, you know, the overarching technology theme, you know, be it from the wheel, the fork, to the pen, to deep fakes on YouTube, to burgeoning AI that is already very much a part of our lives, be it maybe a little bit more of the upper crust, but definitely being more integrated at every level of society. Just, you know, then you have the gatekeepers, you have the information, social media, just everything. It just seems to be a lot in order to get down to what is actual reality, when that reality can literally be something in front of you, but you can be convinced that is not what you're seeing. So.
Thank you, Kyrie. All right, folks, if you'd like to answer that question, if you'd like to comment on that, go ahead and type exclamation mark. CJ, would you like to start?
You know, I was still processing my answer to the previous one. I missed the main idea.
Okay, Kyrie, could you summarize it? Wait a minute, Sandy has something. Sandy, go ahead.
Yeah, if the question is how can you start, what can you do about it? I've got one suggestion. There's a book that I would recommend for anybody that's wondering how they can be part of this thing. It's the book about ignorance and how it drives science by Stuart Firestein. And it's not a new book, but it's still available. And we've had a number of discussions based on that book at the Thinking Society. I'd recommend that to anybody that wants to look at things from a different point of view, because the more we learn, the more ignorant we become. Ignorance grows faster than knowledge, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Wonderful.
One more thing about that. The perspectives that may drive us forward are only possible after we ask other questions and expand our ignorance. Otherwise, we don't know what questions to ask.
Thank you. Let me put one more question on the table, and that was from Jeff. How do we strengthen our willingness to change our mind? So how do we do that? Jeff, was that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, it is. I took your advice and I committed it to writing there and just put it into the chat, you know, in sort of its orientation. But in the simplest sense, it is how to cultivate in ourselves a willingness and ability to change, and how to cultivate in others with whom we have discourse the willingness and the ability to learn, to focus, really to make learning new things the definition of success, rather than successfully presenting our own opinions and convincing others of how right we are. That if we could just get past that to a different frame, then we would both be joining together in sort of serving ourselves and each other in this inquiry, rather than what seems to be such an overwhelming need to prove that we are singularly right.
Wonderful. So let me put third question on the table, which is also related. That's Sue's question. How do we challenge our biases in this? It's kind of a corollary, it's related. So you can answer any of these three questions. Kyrie's question, Jeff's question, or Sue's question. It's going to be Evanique, Katie, Maritza, and Charlie. Evanique.
Yeah, I think the answer to Jeff's question, and maybe Sue's too, is first of all, you have to give up being right about it. I mean, it's the biggest thing in the world, is that take the case that you may not be right, even if you think the person that you're talking to is deeply wrong. And I think once you do that, then you can just listen just to learn and you don't even have to take the case that they're right. You could just take the case that, you know, you both have different perspectives, but I think you have to give that up in order to learn from people. And also, even if you disagree, maybe just say, you know, we disagree and I don't have to be right about it.
Thank you, Evanique. Next up is Katie, Maritza, Charlie, Madeline, and Phil. Katie.
I think if you look at if you put a problem on the table and then you ask each person come up with like 3 ways to solve this problem, you might realize like the same problem can be solved with different ways. And like that would be like training yourself to solve the problem in different ways. And that might also be like, well, they might be using a different way to be solving the same issue. Like to if you're creating different, going first through yourself to solve the problem before you even, that's what I think.
Thank you, Katie. Next up is Maritza, followed by Charlie. Maritza.
I think the very first thing is maybe it's a matter of language. You know, if we take away right versus wrong, then we maybe have a starting point of considering other people's perspectives. Because if you internalize the language that yours is just another perspective. If you internalize that, even if you absolutely believe that your perspective is more tidy or meets more criteria, if you're not viewing it as right or wrong, you've kind of tricked your mind into being more open to somebody else's perspective. I think that sometimes we kind of limit ourselves with our own vocabulary.
Thank you, Marisa. Great observation. Next up is Charlie, Madeline, Phil, and Kyrie. Charlie.
Actually, this is one of my favorite questions. My overarching, I would say, embrace the mystery, but I see it in 2 parts. One is cognitive, and the other is emotional. And the cognitive part is I've taken LSD many times, and one of the things I learned from that experience was that you don't hold on to something that you believe is real, or otherwise you end up jumping off a building thinking you can fly. And so one of the things I learned was to not take any belief seriously. Okay, so it's just like, well, this is an idea. Let's see where we go with it, and so on. The other part is cultivating a sense of confidence within yourself to be able to play like a child. So if you can go into this kind of thing where it's a question of being able to be playful and having fun, not taking anything too seriously, that you will have that courage to be able to jump into really amazing perspectives that you might not ever have thought of before. But anyway, yeah, so it's don't hang on and have fun.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie. Great points. Amazing. Next up is Madeline, Phil, and Kyrie. Madeline.
Yeah, I think I have a 2-part answer. One is that it's a social project. We have to cultivate it in others. And I think that, to some of us, it comes naturally to do it anyway. And to other people, they like their perspective. They want to stay there. They don't want a multiplicity of perspectives. So how do we as social animals encourage that if that's what we believe in? If we believe that a multiplicity of perspectives are good. And just in a brief response to the point CJ raised, I had a conversation with a friend last summer who she believes very, very profoundly in the importance of multiple perspectives. We were talking about gun violence and gun ownership. And I said, well, can you imagine yourself as being someone who feels angry and frightened and threatened and feels that this thing you have your hand on is the only thing that's going to protect you? Can you put yourself in that position? And she was actually offended by the question, that she felt she was somehow, I got the sense she felt she was going to be morally contaminated by putting herself into that other position. And so that's something we're going to come across no matter what your perspective is if you're trying to change other people's.
Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Phil, Kyrie, and Judith. Phil.
To me, this is a very deep problem. The problem is that on the one hand, one wants to be open to other perspectives because you learn from it, you're changed by it and all that. But you also must remember that in one sense, you have a certain perspective that in a sense that steers your ship, your destiny. And so you are committed to a certain perspective, even though it's constantly changing. The most important thing I feel that I do in that regard in relationship to others is to be cautious and not to, in a sense, to understand that I have biases because that what propels me forward, but to be cautious to not let my biases affect others and do harm. Because some biases you do understand that you have, others are deeper and in a sense, silent to yourself. And so you must understand that particularly when you're dealing with vulnerable and minority people, that you do not want to be an unconscious colonializer. So the most important thing is to do no harm. And only when you realize that you're so open that you're probably not going to do any harm, could you engage with others in an open way because you do not want to subliminally affect them, even though you did not know that you did. So one has to be cautious in relationship, particularly dealing with vulnerable people and minority people. Do no harm. That's the most important thing. And then do positive things thereafter.
Thank you, Phil. Next up is Kyrie, followed by Judith, and then CJ.
Yeah. This is what I struggle with, these set of questions, which is the main reason I posted my original one. But to address the other two related ones, kind of to piggyback off what Maritza said earlier, we really have to put ourselves in, if there is such a thing, an objective state or an objective state of reality, to take ourselves out of the equation and along with that our biases. If we really want to have this open dialogue and this way of not centering the conversation on ourselves and our own perspectives and saying that we have the moral high ground, we are the morally righteous, I'll hear you, but I won't listen to you. So I think it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. On the one hand, you really have in a lot of societies, not some, but more societies where listening or the art of listening is dying. It's a dying art. So therefore conversation kind of becomes stagnant. On the other hand, while you do want to be open and you do want to have the willingness to shift your perspective and to not fall into that moral righteousness rut, at the same time, in order for humanity to progress, you have to stand for something. And usually that is some form of the truth, at least for a certain group. So, there's that old saying, stand for something or you'll fall for anything. You don't want to come into things super guarded, but at the same time, you want to still, it's just human nature to search for that nugget of truth. It's that reassurance that something is real, and that you're not in the middle of a bad LSD trip. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kyrie. Next up is Judith and CJ. Judith.
Yeah, I would just say listen, because and remember that because for every truth that you hold, there's a history behind that truth that brought you there. So the same is true for every other individual. So sometimes we look only at the surface conclusion that we're debating. It should be A or B, and you're arguing A or B. But behind each stance, there is a history that has many layers that cause the person to arrive at that place. So if you are not able to look beyond A and B and understand what is the history, then you can't ever be changed or affect change, I don't think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. CJ. CJ, you need to unmute.
it's, you know, we're getting deep into it. It's not the weeds. We're not, but it's starting to feel, it's starting to feel a little like the weeds. How do I bring myself, if not anyone else, to, you know, what I'm thinking is, it really, inquiry is always going to depend on what your objective is. Very often in this group, we get into the modality of learning in general, which invites comprehensivity, invites looking to other peoples and other people for their traditions of inquiry and action and trying to learn from them. But another important aspect of being human is to identify what needs to be done and to try to do it, to see what future we would like to make real. How do we create that? And that shapes. So I don't think objectivity is necessarily what we want, because if we see a future that we would like to move toward, we don't want to get away from ourselves. We want to get toward creating the future that we think would be more desirable. And when you're galvanized by having a more desirable future that you would like to bring about, you may not want to get away from yourself and try to see the world independent of me. You want to gather those traditions of inquiry and action that might help you realize the more desirable future. So but when we set that aside and we go into abstract learning mode, then we come into these problems. So that would be my comment, that maybe when we get to designing improved, more desirable futures, we can address some of these conundrums better than when we're trying to pretend we're on Mount Olympus and we're trying to get a view of the world from the God's eye.
Thank you, CJ. Yeah. So I want to say now, you know, it's going to be my closing remarks and CJ's closing remarks now. So my closing remarks is that I am just delighted with the level of conversation that we did today. Okay. Actually, we've been working at it for quite some time, because it's a question of putting layers and layers and layers of different kinds. Firstly, it is CJ's, you know, amazing group of topics, all of which actually mesh together very beautifully, and they're very diverse and they mesh together. Also, we are relentlessly doing these meetups day after day with this idea of connecting topics, hearing different perspectives, and building kind of common knowledge, you know, common set of values that we can all count on, of saying, you know, pursuit of truth, exploration, value of exploration, and all of that is there in the background. And so I'm just amazed by the payoffs we are getting in meetup after meetup. I'm enormously grateful to people who show up. Also, I also really appreciate the fact that somebody can just show up the first time and feel completely free, that this is not a clique, that they can express themselves as openly, as directly, as comprehensively as anybody else here. And they do. So that, I think that's another thing, that level of openness to somebody who is new. I think that's a hallmark of a kind of an open system. So I'm really delighted with what all of us have achieved, and I'm grateful every day for everybody who shows up. So CJ.
Yeah, I'll just tack on to that, I usually only produce 1 page of notes, and I got 2 pages of notes here. This was an incredible amount of substantive feedback from everyone. Thank you so much. For my closing comments, I have a couple things to try to relate this into the system of comprehensive learning I've been trying to identify and create the desirable alternative future that I'm trying to build. It seems to me all systems of learning or knowing provide epistemic virtues as guideposts for our understanding. I think truth is the coherence of any experience, perspective, hypothesis, or story with regard to these epistemic virtues that our tradition of learning espouses. In comprehensivist learning, our epistemic virtues start with breadth and depth. Our comprehensivity might first assess whether we have been adequately broad. Are we including the ideas of indigenous peoples, of people with minority philosophical, social, and power relations? Are we including people who think differently from us? Maybe even as far as Phil suggested of crazies and criminals. The epistemic virtue of breadth, first of all, requires that we refrain from imposing arrogant imperial and colonial values in our inquiries. The epistemic virtue of depth requires that we explore these other approaches and traditions with enough intensiveness that we're not just superficially looking over their views. In comprehensive learning, we have the epistemic virtue of empiricism, which requires us to check our learning against the experiences of ourselves and all the others who our breadth brings into our sphere of awareness. These empirical considerations, plus our breadth and depth, combine with our epistemic virtue for a thoroughly refined ignorance to further process and clarify our understandings by highlighting the role of questions in cohering and structuring our knowledge. In comprehensive learning, we also recognize that there are always gaps in our understandings. So we aspire to a value of mistake mystique, to recognize and address the always unavoidable misconceptions and misunderstandings that we will uncover in our own thinking and in our whole process over time. In comprehensive learning, once we have compiled a sufficiently broad and sufficiently deep first cut collection of raw knowledge from all the available traditions of inquiry and action, and after we have tested it against our experience with our empiricism, and after we have structured and organized this knowing with questions into a refined ignorance, and after we have exercised our mistake mystique to look at the gaps in our understandings, then we ought to aspire to integrate all that into a whole. This is our epistemic virtue of wholeness, which will be the subject for my September 15th presentation. My draft title is The Whole Shebang, to understand all and put everything together. But briefly, the epistemic virtue of wholeness invites us to put all the approaches and traditions that we have compiled into as complete a story as we can muster, for today at least. Truth, as I suggest, involves assessing the coherence of this integrated story with all our knowing, all our experience, all our questions, and all the inevitable gaps that will creep into the stories we tell about what we know. Truth, as such, is an important epistemic virtue for our knowing, but our mystique, with its recognition of all the remaining gaps in our knowledge, continually reminds us that the truth, the coherence of our integrated story, it is always limited and never fully trustworthy. I believe that is the profound lesson that Tricia Wang is presenting to the technologists who aspire to design our futures. It is also a significant realization for our comprehensive learning.
Thank you. Thank you, CJ. And the whole shebang is going to be on September 15th. So let me tell you what is coming up between now and then for Comprehensivist Wednesdays. Next Wednesday, the 25th, Sanjay will be back, continuing his series on neuroscience. On September 1st, I'll be interviewing Charlie here on his adventure as a polymath across his life. He not only has maintained the spirit of a child, but he teaches children how to build that and keep that. So I'm really looking forward to that interview. On September 8th, Mike Amori will be back, and he's going to do Meetup series on connecting different ideas, which is what he's been doing all his life. And he will be taking some of the ideas that we work with across meetups and trying to connect them and showing you how you can connect your own expertise with other expertise. So that's going to be kind of more of exercises and kind of hands-on kind of experimenting with connecting different fields. So that is what comes between now and the whole shebang. All right, so with that, CJ, always an honor, always a delight. Thank you so much. And everybody, I mean, this was just a wonderful, wonderful meetup. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.